founder of School Sims, and I am delighted on behalf of the School Sims team to welcome you to our panel webinar today. We have a wonderful group of panelists and moderator, and delighted to have this conversation, and in particular dealing with the challenge of preparing equity-centered school leaders and really focusing on the challenge of implementation, right? It's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing to actually get it done. And so this is the agenda that we'll have today. We'll do a couple of welcome introductory comments and start introducing the panelists, and then begin some panel discussion, and obviously leave time for Q&A. For those of you who submitted questions in your registrations, we will hope to get to those as well, in addition to the questions that we have prepared. But hopefully there'll be an opportunity for insights across the various experiences and programs that our panelists represent, and to get to really unpacking this issue. And for me, I've been doing simulations for over 35 years. And I think that if I asked you to fill in the blank, blank is the best teacher, you'd be able to say that experience is the best teacher. We know that. That's how we learn from infancy on forward. And it is the most powerful way to learn. And we know that simulations approximate experience, right? You wouldn't put, Mike, the next slide, you wouldn't put a pilot in a plane, you wouldn't put a doctor or next slide, actually, a doctor or nurse into a patient suite without hours of simulation, or any of our military. You would not put them into the field without hours of simulation. And in fact, when athletes are trying to master a skill, they don't do it through instruction, right? It's through hours of practice. And when we think about the challenge in education, when we think about the challenge of administrators, the distinction is certainly with aviation and with healthcare, is that many of the challenges that they face are also procedural, right? There is a procedural element that they need practice. They need to develop muscle memory around following a process to the T, in addition to being thoughtful when obviously things present when they're out of whack. But in education, it's almost all cognitive. And the challenges that our educators and administrators are going to face, and especially with respect to challenges like equity, right, where there is not necessarily a single definition, and certainly not a definition that applies to every child, and certainly not a definition that will be agreed upon by every parent or by all staff members or across the district or across your school system. And so the challenge is in terms of being able to navigate that is significant. Obviously I don't need to tell any of you this, you know that. And so the question is if we're going to prepare people to navigate and to be able to implement, if you will, right, that is going to be a challenge that is kind of complicated to address, right? Because it's not about defining what equity-centered leadership is, or defining what it looks like in terms of those kinds. Those are important, and it's important to have that. But in order to be able to implement it, they need to be able to flex. They need to be able to see when it comes to student outcomes and making sure we have equitable outcomes for every student, that they're able to understand the trade-offs and be able to navigate, because you can't always get it right. You can't please all the people. How do you make those decisions? How do you determine which direction you're going to follow? And how are you going to then deal with the consequences that happen? Because you're not going to always be right, that's for certain, but you still got to be prepared to keep going, because that's the job. And so the only way to do that is going to be through practice. The only way we can get better at that, whereas we're never going to solve for it, but the only way to get better is practice. And obviously simulation is a key tool for enabling that kind of approach, where we can start to build. I think one of the most important skills is going to be self-efficacy. People need to be, aspiring administrators need to be confident enough in their capability, not that they can solve a problem, but that they can deal with them as they come, and that they can flex in terms of whatever's required. They're going to be able to navigate and deal with it, even if it doesn't go well, because it's pretty certain, right, that things won't go as expected, and hopefully it's not horrible, but that can't be predicted, because so many of the things that happen are irrational, and you just have to roll with it. And so the opportunity to build efficacy only happens through practice, only happens through being in those kinds of situations and being able to practice with the decision-making and ultimately be able to move on. And the further benefit of that is if you have self-efficacy as a leader, one of the things that it enables you to do is to build collective efficacy and enable your team to feel comfortable with whatever they're dealing with because they're going to look to you. So how do you prepare all of this? This is, for us, why simulation is such a powerful tool. And these are scalable. They are choose your own adventure because it is all about decision-making and consequences. And we'll come back to talk a little bit more about that. But that's kind of the focus that we have because the challenge really is implementing equity-centered leadership. How do you actually prepare folks to get it done? And so with that, I wanted to tee up the panel. Our moderator is going to be Michael Johanneck from the University of Pennsylvania, formerly the head of for many years, the head of the mid-career program at Penn. Now he's just a regular old faculty member, as he's able to focus on more than just the requirements of the program. So I'm delighted to introduce Mike and to hand it over to him, and he will introduce the panelists and begin the discussion about this challenging skill set. Mike?
Thank you, Ken. And it's good to see everybody this afternoon. Let's see if we can move this slide forward here. And yes, if you see a smile on my face, it is have to do with the fact that after having program administration responsibilities for 17 years, I don't this year. So for those of you who've ever had the opportunity to step away from a little bit of that, you'll know what that's like. So it's particularly, I have here some of the things that that I'm working on right now. Particularly this area of judgment project, not unrelated to what Ken was just talking about in terms of self-efficacy. But looking across fields, because as we started from the beginning of this presentation, when Ken was talking about the different professions that use simulation, it's an opportunity. Simulations also becomes a tool that is shared across fields. So we don't have to be learning everything about self-efficacy, about equity-centered leadership on our own within the profession of education. There are other fields who've been wrestling with this in different contexts in different ways. And so that's part of what we're doing in Judgment Project and some of the work we're doing in the Inter-American Leadership Network. But the real key today is that we have a phenomenal set of guests with great experiences from different backgrounds, who each has a sort of interesting mix of backgrounds, both from academic experiences as well as from experiences within schools in various different settings. So I want to turn first to Dr. Richard Gonzalez, who's Associate Professor in Residence and directs the Ed Leadership Preparation Programs at UConn's MEAC School of Education. Richard, if you want any for particular additional, I've been very strict, by the way, just so everybody's aware. I've given people, I think, like 2 minutes to talk, which is a crazy, ridiculous amount of time for their introduction. But if you could offer a few additional thoughts on your background and then ways in which SIMs figure into your work as a way to just prepare us for our conversation.
Sure thing. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I come to this conversation with a background as a practitioner primarily in Texas. And then I have spent the last 12 years in higher education at the University of Connecticut, overseeing for the last 10 years the principalship and the superintendency preparation programs, devoting most of my time and energy to the principalship because that is my passion. So to start, one of the things that we were fortunate to have at UConn was the opportunity to participate in one of the Wallace Foundation initiatives. It was the University Principal Preparation Initiative. Virginia State, my colleague who will be talking in just a moment, was a part of that group. And, one of the things that I would say our charge was to update our programs to better meet the needs and reality of the field. And so we went at UConn from a very traditional graduate type of program where students wrote papers and they read, the latest, greatest things. But we really didn't engage them very much in the real work of, being a school level leader or even a district level leader. So when we redesigned, we thought about what would it take to get them there. We didn't use SIMS prior to that. And so SIMS became part of our redesign, our plan of study, how we would prepare folks for the reality of leadership. So as I prepared for this conversation today, what I thought about was how is it that using Sims has mattered to improving prep at UConn? Because it absolutely has. And Sims provide an experience, as Ken said. Experience is the best teacher. It provides sheltered experience. We also believe that leadership learning happens socially. And so there's a lot of conversation. So the students or the aspiring leaders have conversations together as they're going through the simulations, after they're going through the sims. They talk through and sometimes do a simulation with their mentors, with their leadership coach, and then sometimes with their instructors. But I would say one of the things that I like in our students, our aspiring leaders, we call them UCAP leaders, will tell you probably because I've got a little sadistic side to me, but I love that it just frustrates them. The simulations frustrate them. They don't have enough information, all the information that they like. They don't have the ideal choices. They would say, I would do something else. And we say, great. Now, given these, what would you do and why? And the reality is they, like all of you, like all of us, are trying to do our best to make things better, make things more fair, more just, given less than ideal circumstances. And that's what difference that Sims has made, at least at UConn.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. And um, great to have you. Great to have you here with us. Great to have also Dr. Lizette Navarrete-Burks, Assistant Professor of Ed Leadership and a Fellow at the University of Houston Downtown Center for Critical Race Studies. Lizette, do you have some of her information about her background here? Again, a person bringing this mixture of experiences as well as operating, as Richard was just indicating, both at their institutional level and in national conversations. Lizette?
Thank you for the introduction, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here and share this space with you all. And I had the great pleasure of also spending time. I'm native to Texas. I'm back home here in Texas, and I reside in Houston. We're one of the most diverse cities here in the US, and I predominantly work with leaders, aspiring leaders of color. And we are in such a rich community in terms of cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. And so those components are the heart of our program. We have a newly launched graduate degree program for aspiring mid-level management leaders here in Texas. And so I've been learning and really taking a look at other programs. I also had the great pleasure of creating a teacher leadership program during a postdoc at the University of Arkansas. And something I really learned there is along the lines of what Richard really shared is just this idea of like being able to watch others in a sheltered sort of environment where you get to really take a look at how to lead better, but through this simulation in sort of a sheltered environment. And so we were able to do that at the University of Arkansas. And as I was hired here as an assistant professor at the University of Houston downtown, this idea of simulations and modeling in that sheltered environment was certainly something that I wanted to add to our program. So I was on the search for what that could be and how could we incorporate components from the groundwork that we laid for this new program. And so that's where simulations came into our conversation of really taking a look at our programming and the coursework that students complete. And so simulations have been a great addition for our program. I'm also going to put in the chat that a similar component in terms of really thinking about cases and grappling, as Richard mentioned, the sadistic side of like really helping folks chew through tension and what that looks like. I couple the simulations with these journal cases and educational leadership. And the coupling of those has really empowered students to kind of talk about their experiences. And something I appreciate in working with predominantly leaders of color is that oftentimes they come from communities that have been oppressed in our systems in our society. And so getting them to really move towards identity development and feeling like a leader and wanting to change and make change, I think is important. And so I couple these resources, the simulations and the Journal of Cases in Educational Leadership. I couple those with our online tool that we have called VoiceThread, where we really unpack together sort of all of the components throughout the week that we're grappling with. And so that really helps to share across experiences with what is going on within the simulations and within the case studies. So I find that it really helps in terms of students telling their stories, and often stories of oppression for themselves or for their students or for the communities that they belong to. And this helps to really unpack those dimensions of equity that we see both in the journal cases, but also the simulations as well. So I'm excited that those have added such a foundational component to our program. And so I look forward to sharing more today, but thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lizette. Sorry for the little funkiness with the slides there, but thank you for sharing that. Great to have you with us. We're also joined by Dr. Eva Mathieu-Scher, Assistant Professor at School of Ed at Duquesne. And again, as we have seen, somebody who brings both particular expertise out of higher education, but also experience on the ground in K-12 schools. So, Reva.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So my experience is a little bit different, which is I think why we are all here. So I'm sort of a blend of psychology, applied behavior analysis, leadership, all mixed up into this one ball of things. And so I primarily teach in the ABA program at Duquesne, but I've also taught in the special education program, and I work collaboratively with our ed administration, and I am a former current practitioner. I still say I'm a practitioner. And, you know, getting an opportunity to think about the simulation piece. So we do utilize school sims as part of our educational administration and leadership program. We also utilize behavior skills training within our ABA program, which is an element of simulation. So as you all have been talking about, this idea of saying and doing are two different things. Both of those components really look at, yes, we can talk about this from a conceptual level. Yes, we can talk about this cognitively. Yes, we can maybe even write about it. But what happens when we're asked to do it? And so that is the component where, you know, we really see students struggle a little bit, and this idea of critical thinking skills and being able to sort of make decisions in the moment when they're in the hot seat, maybe talking to a very difficult parent, like all of those things factor into your ability to make good, sound, thoughtful decisions. I will also echo that our students really enjoy doing the simulations with the instructor, and they love when the instructor makes the wrong decision or a decision that doesn't necessarily go to plan. And it certainly gives folks an opportunity to dialogue, to discuss, to talk about, you know, we've had similar responses, whereas, well, I wouldn't do that. And it's like, well, sometimes you don't necessarily have the opportunity to make the perfect decision, or you don't have the time to really think about and have all of those resources, and you still have to make a decision. The last component that I will also mention is a lot of my research is in the area of long-term crisis leadership. So much of my practice was with students who engaged in some significant behavioral challenges over time, which oftentimes ended up being a long time crisis within the school environment. And in those situations and scenarios, the ability to lead is always challenging, but the ability to lead within crisis and within ongoing crisis is also very unique and challenging. And so simulations give an opportunity to sort of practice that. And Ken and I were talking briefly the other day, and this idea that when you're in the simulation, it almost feels like you're in a realer environment. And so it gives students an opportunity to be vested and to sort of start to feel a little bit like what it would be like in practice. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to our continued discussions today.
Great. Thank you very much. Great to have you here. And we're also pleased to have Dean Dr. Willis Walter, College of Ed at Virginia State University. Again, with this wonderful mix of both experience within the higher ed realm as well as a practitioner for a good number of years. We won't say how many because I would be implied in those kinds of things as well. So just having abundant experience in both areas. And Dr. Walter.
Well, yeah. Let me just say, Mike, that having been a classroom teacher for many years in both Florida as well as Alabama, and then being an administrator in Alabama at both the middle school and a rural middle school and urban setting elementary school as a principal, equity became a part of who I was. And so when taking on the challenge of coming to another institution, this being my third higher ed institution that I've worked with in the College of Education, the one thing that the Wallace Foundation really made very clear to us, as Richard already said, that we were in the same class as UConn, in going through and identifying what made us good as an institution and identifying how we could be greater through our work with Wallace. And the one thing that kept coming up was that many of our students were good because of some of our faculty and some of the exchange that was going on. But the way that we were going to become greater and be a great institution of higher education in ed leadership was to really focus on the intentional things that we could do in bringing out who our students were and what their backgrounds really were coming into the classroom. And so for us, it was about us being intentional. And that's what the Sims really gave us an opportunity to do. The simulations gave us an opportunity to really focus on certain scenarios and bring out certain information out of the student's background. Because we all know when students start to peel back that onion, and they start to tear up and start to cry, it's quick. You'll stop. Many of us, say that's enough when we first start peeling back that onion. But what the Sims really allow us to do is to keep peeling, to keep going deeper. And therefore, our students find out a little bit more about who they are. And if there's one thing that I really have a problem with educators is that many of them don't know themselves, don't know who they are. Many of our leaders don't know themselves, don't know who exactly they are. And what this gives us an opportunity to do is help them identify exactly who they are in both good times and easy situations, but also how that could change you when you go through more difficult times and the simulations get more difficult and the problems and your decision making end up leading to more layers being peeled back. And so for us, it was about that intentionality and us being able to really put them in a controlled atmosphere, whereas they could really experience who they are and how great they could be if they just continue to peel those different layers.
Thank you very much. I like that onion peeling thing. Yes, especially the tears part. I guess kind of it worked very well all the way across. So as you can see, everybody can see what a privilege to have our four panelists here and the kinds of experiences. And so what we really want to do in looking at equity-centered leadership and sort of get from your vast experiences here is we're focused on these kinds of questions. We want to understand, first of all, as Ken was mentioning, there are a lot of different ways in which people are using the terminology around let's have more equity-centered leadership out there. I don't want to go off into a philosophical discussion about it, but I do want to get to sort of a sense of what does it look like as you're working with leaders and you're saying, that doesn't look right. And we're going to try to, these are some challenges that we're facing. What does that look like in your work? And secondly, how do the simulations figure into that? And I'm going to maybe focus on just those first couple of questions, and then we can have a conversation about that. And then I want to make sure we have some time at the end there to talk about what's most promising in terms of what we do next, so that we can be both looking concretely at what the challenges are that you all are seeing in the work that you're doing, and where you see the most promising directions for us to keep, Willis, as you were saying, getting greater in this work. So who might want to kick us off? And I was assured that this is a highly conversational crowd here. So to just, what is it that you're trying to, what are you seeing in the practice and saying, this is a challenge. This is the part that we need to be addressing and working on. And we see Sims as a part of that somehow with some other things that we're doing. Who can help us get us started?
I think Willis hit the nail on the head in terms of being able to really know who you are as a leader and tapping into that. And I'm going to put, folks have mentioned on the call already, the Wallace Foundation, and I really appreciate the framing that this particular report that I put in the chat. It talks about this critical consciousness that's needed. And it's an understanding of historical oppression to inform how you achieve equity today. And so that takes some internal work and really knowing who you are, knowing what makes you and your identity and your positionality. And all of those things really help to inform your identity and your understanding of equity. But it's also these other components that are actionable, right? So in the study that I put, or the summary that I put in the chat, it talks about creating inclusive environments, making sure that you are leading in promoting equity and excellence in the school. So there are actionable steps, but there's also this internal work that happens as well. And so I find that both of those are very necessary. And as Willis mentioned, the simulations really support in sort of unpacking and peeling back those layers about who you are and better understanding yourself, which I find that there's less tools for us to help and prepare school leaders with that internal component. So I appreciate that this provides that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess I'll jump in and just say, I think candidates have to think, if you're really talking about an equity-centered candidate, they have to think about the end in mind, right? That they have to be thinking about how this is affecting different levels or different groups of people at the same time when they make their different decisions. And it's, I think it really comes back to the data and looking at the data to see if what you intended to happen actually happened. If you really want to look at making sure that what you've really set out to do is happening. And then last but not least, I think looking at that data and seeing if you stayed true to who you thought you were or who you were intended to be. Whereas you're always holding up a mirror to make better decisions going down the road, because we're never perfect. But the closer and closer we can get to what we're seeking and what we're trying to get to is, I think, all of our goals, no matter what the scenario is when you start it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say one of the challenges that we're all facing, doesn't matter which state or the type of institution, or whether it's K-12 or higher ed, is that educators are operating and practicing in a very polarized society. And it's not just politically. It's a time these days, and it's been for a while, that decisions aren't neutral. And you can't just disagree very easily. It's going to be escalated to, you're evil, you're a bad guy, you have to be taken out, you have to be brought down. So how do you prepare folks, right? Improving instruction is hard enough. helping make the moves that will help promote student learning, improving a school is hard enough. And yet there's still a lot more to the reality of the work. To Willis's point into what Lizette said, knowing yourself, understanding, broadly the discourse, the reality of the local context, and then the society around you makes a difference. And then to what Reva said earlier, the engagement between the folks in the programs and the aspiring leaders allows you to get real. I'll be honest with you, I was kind of surprised that Ken asked me to sit in on this panel after I told him every year that we engage together in a particular sim with our students. It's one that, the leader is faced with, among your options, do you apologize to the parent? And I told Ken, sorry, every year, I know, even though I've been told it every time before then that wasn't necessarily the best option. I just said respectfully, I'll be damned if I don't apologize to a parent, because I'm gonna, as the leader of the school, as, the son to the folks who raised me, right, and grandson, I have to do that. That's the right thing to do. We'll take it from there. We can do business from there, but no matter what, hey, if I was on the other side, what would I hope would be done? What would feel right to me? And every time, even though I know it's not going to get validated very well with the feedback from the simulation, I still apologize.
Just to piggyback off of that, it really makes you think about the fact that decisions don't occur in a vacuum, right? And so while simulations and school sims provide an opportunity that is somewhat flexible based on experiences and situations and whatnot, the decisions that we're making don't occur in a vacuum. And like you had mentioned, context is everything. And sometimes there's more information and less information. So that really stuck out. I will also say, like, talking about primary goals and challenges, building trust, which obviously is a huge thing, and we could unpack that a million different ways, but within the classroom, but also as future leaders, because in my opinion, that's a key element to be able to be a successful leader, and also being honest. So one of the pieces that I'm very passionate about is this idea of inclusion, right? And thinking about equity as it relates to disability, and oftentimes those are some folks that are left out of the equation when we talk about equity, and having a really honest conversation with my students about the fact that we have a special education department and a general education department, and those two places we do, but we don't really coexist, right? Like, they're very different. And when you go into schools, you have a special education group and then you have a general education group, and they're very much so separate. And there's lots of reasons for that. And I know this example is very specific, but in terms of leaders and leadership, we need to move into these are our kids as opposed to that's your kid or my kid. And it seems simple on the surface, but when you really look at the systems, both in higher ed and K-12, like, those systems and the way that they are set up are not conducive to doing that. And so we have to prepare leaders for that.
And yeah, Reva, I would just echo that, and also say, yeah, simulations are a beautiful tool if used correctly. And what I mean by that is that you need, number one, faculty that have had experience, whereas they can help you justify and navigate some of these crucial conversations. You also have to have faculty that are willing to put aside their own personal views and allow the candidates to share their personal views and not condemn them for their different views. We talked a lot about at the beginning about knowledge of self, but our second layer for us is also making sure we understand the trauma that others go through and how that plays a role in decision making, and how that might not lead to the same decisions that you make. However, they're just as valid. And if you don't have faculty or leaders that are understanding that, then it makes it very difficult for one to learn from those simulations that you put them through. And so I think it's very important that you use them correctly, that you try to help it make it seem as realistic as possible, but also to provide that time for self-reflection that all of us need in order for us to make good conscious thought and make better decisions the next time. And then also, I think when you start talking about that, making for a greater dialogue between the student or the candidate and those in the room, so that you can make sure that everybody's thought is given. When looking at some of those simulations, as Richard was saying, you might simply disagree, but that's a valid reason for disagreeing, and therefore you need to make sure that everybody is valued in that conversation. And then the last thing I would say is it always provides immediate feedback, which through these simulations, it is great at the end, at the conclusion. There's no right or wrong. It's just, how do we grow? And so for me, providing that kind of feedback of what happens next, it really makes it all worthwhile to go through each and every one of those different sims.
I would also just say the opportunity to be able to do this within a multidisciplinary team, because that again is what it's like or should be like in practice, right? Like you're not making, well, sometimes you are, but not very often. You're not making decisions in isolation. You're working as part of a larger team. And so the School Sims gives you an opportunity to, you know, choose your own adventure, but also I say play with friends. And so that that in itself can be really helpful as students are sort of learning how to navigate that process.
Can I ask, just wonderful, thank you, Ever. I mean, this idea of, it sounds like the learning about self that folks are talking about, that's critical in leadership, is also applies to the faculty and the programs that you're working with and your colleagues in terms of learning self and learning to play well in the sandbox, even if institutional incentives are not always aligned that way. Although I'm sure your institutions are all exceptions to that rule. But how have you had experiences in which Sims sort of help break those boundaries a bit? I mean, I think you're right. I'm hearing about the experiences people can bring in from different points of view in the room, and so you suddenly begin to validate an experience that I might have had 5 years ago in a situation like this because it informed my choice. Are you seeing that play out with faculty as well and colleagues? I'm just wondering if you have any experiences on sort of that self-knowledge journey as well.
I definitely have. I've seen some faculty that have emotionally had some difficult times addressing certain situations, certain scenarios, because it was still that fresh. It might have happened 10 to 15 years prior to that particular faculty member, but it still had the same visceral effect on them emotionally. And you have to navigate for that. Just like we navigate, I think, for all kinds of trauma and emotions coming out when one teaches and are exposed to others' trauma, that we have to, that's why it's so important to know yourself, because you have to know those triggers that are coming up and help prepare yourself for that, as well as maybe other colleagues that might need to step in if that were the case. And in at least one scenario, we had to have another faculty member kind of navigate the group through because of that emotion was just too strong for the one faculty member to actually do what they were intending on doing and getting across what they were intending on getting across to the rest of the class.
I'm struck by that because it seems that one of the advantages of the Sims, as everyone is saying, is that it makes it a bit more real. But that also means it's going to draw from people's own real experiences, which, as you're saying, may be quite traumatic related to those kinds of situations. Does it, I mean, I'm sort of trying to understand your own experiences in navigating for those to be productive conversations so that folks can move forward in their own understanding of self and the perspectives of others. Or, I mean, are there experiences that you have found that particularly where there have been strong lessons learned in terms of, if we're going to simulate it and get closer to that reality, we're going to get closer to your experiences, and we need to keep working on how we process those, I suppose. I don't know if any of you have experiences on those that come to mind.
Well, I know I'm
But
not
for
supposed
us at UConn, oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead,
Willis.
go ahead, go ahead. Well, I was just gonna say, I know we're not supposed to do this, but I'm going to put a plug in for Ken, because the one thing that he also allowed us to do was to also give feedback on some of the simulations in which we were working with. And that has allowed for us to grow even greater in some of the conversations that we've had, as well as to change some of the sims that we were utilizing in a different kind of way. I'm sorry, Richard.
No, not at all. I was just going to say that for us at UConn, it was less at the personal level, and it was for us kind of more instructionally and pedagogically, right? So, as I said, Sims was not something that was not a resource that we used. So we agreed, got to have a committee. So we had a committee and reviewed it, made recommendations, even suggested how it would be used. So then we did that. But, interestingly, discussion, emphasis of the importance of the instructional core is a huge part of our preparation of school level leaders. And yet we were ignoring that. So we were just trying to plug in the resource without adjusting our teaching and without giving thought to students and what they were bringing or not bringing and what we were bringing or not bringing to the table. And so I would say after, through a couple of years of early implementation, those things surfaced. And so we had to have conversations about, you don't just use it and plug it in, or you can, but that's not necessarily gonna get you what you're looking for. You have to think about your preparation differently. You have to think about your participation, including that you can be a right? So it's not just a facilitator of the sim, but you can be someone who's participating in the conversation. And that requires a lot more awareness and skill, right, on what it takes to do that well. And so I would say the biggest shift has been that for us, not so much at that personal level, self-awareness, just kind of more instructional pedagogy.
And I would just add, or again, my opinion, but you want students to experience a little bit of that at different levels, because the reality is in practice, they're gonna do that, right? And so in this sort of environment, it's supportive, they have coaching, it's not a real parent or a real student or a real situation. But the reality is that they're gonna have to do some of these things, and they, the more opportunities that they have, again, not exactly the same, but to practice doing instead of just taking in information and sort of saying, well, I would do this, as opposed to, I'm doing it. We've had a lot of feedback from students that have talked about that disconnect between learning the information, sort of, talking about it, but the actual practice of doing it is a different thing, and they need opportunities to try it. And then also to get feedback, right? It's not a linear process. So different situations can go in lots of different directions. And, as a former principal, there have been times where I've finished a conversation and been like, I had no idea that was going to end the way it did or go in the direction that it went in. So opportunities for students to experience that in sort of a supported discussion, reflection experience, I think is a really good practice for them.
This conversation reminds me of one of the simulations that is focused on equity, but specifically about English language learners or emerging bilingual students. And so I remember one of my students saying, oh, this should be easy. Like, this is my my field, and so I feel confident about this one. And so what I was really excited about as we unpack that simulation and really thinking about self is that oftentimes I see professional development around equity from a very privileged standpoint. So that critical consciousness is about from a privileged group, not further oppressing or further disenfranchising marginalized communities. But what this simulation really helped us unpack as aspiring leaders of color is that that critical consciousness is also needed for people of color, because oftentimes, as this student was really unpacking this simulation, not continuing systems of oppression that were done to that person or their communities. And so that critical consciousness looks different for different folks. And I appreciated how Reva talked about, speaking upon all students as if they're our own, and having that intercultural sort of competence is really important. And my training comes a lot from my science background. I really love the mechanism of how, folks learn and the science of learning. And another resource that came to mind as we were having a discussion is just what tools are available to continue learning about self. I put a survey tool that's been really helpful in our leadership programs, the ones that I've been a part of, to include to kind of see where you are with your intercultural competence. And then it provides a sort of training component as well about how do you improve that. And so that way you can get to a point where you talk about students as not that those students or this group, but it's all students and ours is really helpful.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate so much this conversation. It's certainly something I mentioned. We're working with a number of other professions and some of this simulation and kind of judgment work, and this reflection portion for everybody to see about their own experiences and where they position themselves and what you can learn from wherever you are in your positioning, particularly in this matter in terms of inclusivity and equity concerns and consciousness, is something that is the key area that certainly research in lots of other fields tells us. That's the point where you get a lot of your bump in terms of people's growth, is in that kind of structured dialogue and reflection afterwards. I want to turn in a moment to the questions that some of our participants or the attendees were kind enough to send in advance. And even though we have no homework requirements for these webinars, it was great to get some of these in advance. So we want to share those in a moment. But I want to give everybody a chance, of the panelists, to comment on this last question of what's exciting. This is certainly challenging work, richly good, positively challenging, I hope, but also one that can be daunting over time. And I want to sort of see where you see the most promising pieces, as well as those things that are most urgent. But where are we moving, possible to move the needle forward in this kind of work?
I guess I'll jump in again. I think the most promising part is where technology is just taking us. When you just look at AI and virtual reality, you think it was real before. I think there are all kinds of ways in which I think virtual reality and other contexts can be added to some of these conversation or scenarios now. As well as I think just the flexibility of some of the current sims, a tweak here and there to make sure that they keep being relevant and or have the kind of intended impact, because things are changing so rapidly in our communities and different situations, things that we didn't think were situations 2, 3, 4 years ago, now all of a sudden are a big problem. And so refining some of those current simulations to meet those needs or to address those kinds of concerns that are coming out from parents and from policymakers.
Excellent, thank you. Other thoughts?
I'm excited to see the discussion around equity expand beyond achievement. And so thinking about access, power, identity, I have known to be a resource sharer. So I apologize for the multiple links I'm putting in the chat, but I really appreciate this power or dimensions of equity framing from Dr. Gutierrez in an article that she wrote. And oftentimes I see equity stay at like a very superficial level. It's like, you know, how do you achieve it if we can't define it and really unpack what it is? So I appreciate this framing to really think about it's more than just achievement. It's a holistic view of students and how do we take care of the whole student, and achievement is just one small component of it. So really defining what that is and really being able to hone in on all the aspects, because that's how we achieve equity, is really making sure that it's that holistic view of how we look at students, is not just achievement by itself.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you.
I would say the most encouraging thing to me is what I'm experiencing outside the state of Connecticut in my work with other states, higher education, and some districts. There are places where equity is not something that you can say, you can tout. You shouldn't really assign readings to it. It's discouraged, if not prohibited. And yet the spirit is still there. Folks are not discouraged. They're not quitting. They're still as committed to preparing leaders that are fair-minded, that are working on outcomes that are just. And it's not gaming. It's not just changing language. They're just bringing it with the intention of, you know, things are not where they should be, where we would like them to be. There's still work to be done, and whatever it takes to get you there.
Yeah. That is an encouraging note to go on to the next slide on, but thank you. Thank you, I think, for all of those points. We had some questions from folks that were submitted in advance, so I'm going to give the panels a chance to take a look at these and the sort of areas and topics that were of interest, and invite you to choose any and all that you want to take a look at and respond to and perhaps offer. And or provide materials and resources, Lizette. I happen to be one who I love on the fact that I come to webinars and I get a bunch of stuff that it saves me finding these things down in the future. So I thank you very much for anything that you're going to share there. Who might want to pick up some of the questions that were submitted in advance, and then again, thanks to our attendees for taking the time to surface these.
I think that second one really hits home for me, the role of school boards in policy setting. When I was a practicing leader, not in higher education, I was a part of a school district where from the school board, we had really equity focused initiatives. And that made our work so much easier and connected and aligned, that we're working towards the same goal. And so I am a huge proponent or advocate of really sitting at the table and really making sure that policy is something that we pay particular attention to, because it can have such great impact across an organization. And so policy at the national level, state level, local level, I'm always encouraging folks to sign up to be on those committees and to support those, because I think that that interconnectedness is really important. And so if it's done at the policy level, it makes things a lot easier for us to implement these sorts of initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
I think also on number 3, the bias, trust issues, and equity in the classroom. A lot of our parents today don't trust teachers or educators, and therefore don't trust the administrators. And you have to build that trust through your decision making. And so to do some of those simulations, and also identifying your own bias. And I work at a historically Black college and university, but some of us still, because of our some of our middle class background, some of us have achieved at a certain level, doing things a certain way. We have some learned bias that we don't always see just by looking at some of our previous backgrounds or previous decisions. And so being in a situation where some of those simulations cause you to rethink, I think that also is great for not only administrators, but just educators in general. And would love to see more conversations around that out in the open so that people can see that we all go through those struggles sometimes with our own internal bias.
I would just piggyback on the trust piece. So as a leader, you know, it's your responsibility to build trust with your team, but also with families and communities. And oftentimes this is sort of expected that leaders know how to do this. It's just something that you have or you don't have. And I think that that's a real disservice to folks that we're sort of leading and bringing along within these programs, because not, you know, we don't all have those interpersonal skills at the same level. So we're not usually explicitly taught that throughout school. And this is some of my behavioral background and my work in compassionate care and ABA. But oftentimes it's assumed that people know how to do this and are good at this, and that is so key to everything that goes along with being a leader. And oftentimes not everyone has those skills, or maybe the level of those skills are splintered in some areas. So I do think that we sometimes just sort of skip over that and assume that, you know, everybody is at the same place as far as that is concerned. And I think that that's something that we have to focus more on, because trust and respect and all of those things are essential to being able to be an equitable leader.
I wanted to just thank you all. That's great. I could sit here and talk with you all for hours. We are near the top of the hour, and just want to let people know we are willing to stay beyond the hour, but we certainly understand for those of you who need to jump at the top. Mike, if you could go to the next slide. If you're interested in learning more about simulations, obviously, please feel free to reach out. Happy to show a sim. I think it's important that one of the things that came out of the discussion, right, is the practice idea, which can be simulation. Obviously, it's in the way we design it, obviously with in mind for its scalability, but it's actually just practice, right? It can be in various forms. And it's just the importance of thinking about not just one type of instruction, and to really allow for the idea of doing it wrong, understanding other perspectives, uncovering your own bias, understanding self, things along those lines. But we're delighted to talk with you further. And certainly if you want to see us, I'm happy to walk you through them. So if you haven't seen one before, just so what that looks like. But some of the questions about logistics of implementing, that's something that we can certainly have provide more insight, both from our partners' perspective in terms of the actual activities that they did from integration. And whether you're higher ed or whether you're a district or just a school, the opportunity for SIMS, and I appreciated the importance of what Dean Walter said about the importance of faculty. That can be university faculty, but it could also be another leader, right? The ability to engage in facilitative conversation can be very powerful with a staff relative to how one's implementing, in terms of being able to address, to uncover these transformative, these adaptive type challenges, right? That really are not something that you can have a right and a wrong answer to. So wanted to, again, we can flip back to the slide to talk in more depth. And if there are other questions, please feel free to jump on. But thank you all for participating. And again, for those of you who have to jump, we look forward to being in touch with you. Please feel free to submit your questions or opportunities for further discussion, but we can turn it back to the panel for those who have additional questions or would like to discuss things in a little bit more depth.
And let me, with that, at least then open up. Thank you very much, Ken. And as we continue to see if there are any other questions, for folks who want to just unmute, and for those who can stay, if you want to pop any questions to the wider group and to our panelists.
I did want to respond while we're waiting if others want to chime in on the issue of the research. This is an area that we're quite interested in supporting. So we don't do, as a company, research. We're not staffed for it. But we believe that simulation is a very powerful tool, especially in these kinds of behavioral areas that were unpacked during our conversation, as a tool for getting at some interesting information about how people think, how they do. And if that's an area of interest, we are very happy to work with you in terms of applying, looking at the potential data that comes out of this modality, and looking at ways of supporting that. So if that's something of interest, we'd love to chat further.
And just as a quick note on that, I was just on a prior call to this webinar. We're doing a 4-country study that's using a simulation as a way of trying to get at urban elementary school practice in a way that can translate across these very different contexts. So as a tool for data collection, just giving us some better idea about what's going through people's minds that we're trying to support. Yeah, just to reinforce that. Questions though, comments? I heard somebody moving on their mic, maybe? I think
You
the
find that
I think the Zoom pause is longer than the real world pause. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Yeah, so
they're really processing. But the question of and that was raised of, you know, the different state, the question of how we address the issue when the politics have gotten involved. And you know, obviously we don't have an answer for that. But it is something that, you know, the most important thing is dialogue, right? I mean, I think it is engaging in, even if there are forces, if you will, that may be working towards stymieing that a little bit. But the opportunity to speak is what's most important. And, you know, to what Richard had said about the question of apologizing to parents, right? The modality allows us to be provocative. And the wonderful discussion that comes out of you having that feeling, Richard, in terms of you're bothered by it, and therefore you want to talk about, well, wait a minute. Of course, I'm going to apologize to this parent, and unpacking why you feel that way and why it's different than what people might hear from the pure appropriate or protecting oneself perspective. But being able to surface that dialogue, the insight that can come from both the lived experience that you've had and others, and getting people talking about it, is the power of this modality. It's not about the tool, it's about what it enables. And often that is an opportunity to get at that, uncovering the bias and the trust aspects of being able to see that there are other ways of doing things that are equally valid, that I don't have to be right, or I don't have to know what the only, you know, I don't have to have the answer. But to engage in this and to have that be, again, part of the muscle memory that we engage in, which is not that I feel the efficacy in myself, but that I feel comfortable enough to actually engage in the conversation, to ask what you think and engage accordingly.
and just to echo something too that maybe Ken doesn't want me to be saying, but I also would highly suggest people send recommendations for tweaks, for topics, for other things, for, hey, you know what? That was the topic 2 years ago, but now it's this one, or it's got to be phrased this way, or whatever it might be. And we're all in that, we're swimming in that same water. So I think that's part of what, I mean, when Ken and I first got together about this idea about establishing SIMS, it really was about capturing practice and getting as close to it as possible. So input on that is critical for this to remain a vital tool. Otherwise, it always has to me, the great success is when you go to, you know, when I do a group activity with a simulation and somebody says, man, that happened to me last week. Well, obviously it didn't, because this thing has been a sim for 9 months. But that's what we're needing to get to. And I think actually that to Richard, to your point about the spirit out there, I think you know, my hope, maybe this is quixotic, is I think that the closer we keep it to practice and say, here are the situations that we need people to act well in, that might give us a greater spans of common ground to move the work forward. But anyway, any other questions, thoughts, or anything else? I want to make sure, I think, before, as people may be thinking about a final question, to thank our panelists, Lizette and Willis and Riva and Richard, really just for a wonderful conversation, and for sharing your time and so much hard-won experience through the program work you've been doing. So thank you for sharing that and the resources.
And I echo that as well. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Well, we can only go for so long. So we thank you all, for those of you who are still here, for your participation. Look forward to hearing from you, to talking with you about this. I mean, there's no shortage of opportunities to continue to expand and how this topic needs to be addressed, amongst others. But really, it is all about student outcomes, and whether we're focusing in the classroom, or whether we're focusing on the support, whether we're focusing at the administration, there's plenty of opportunity to continue to grow. And we look forward to connecting with you further.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Ladies, it was
Have a good
great
one,
meeting
everybody.
you.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.